Let's get up to speed on what's happening with schools next year. The return of many schools will be delayed beyond the government's earlier promise. According to the Education Secretary, exam year students will return on the 11th of January, with other secondary school students to follow a week later on the 18th to enable preparations for the testing of pupils and staff to take place. While the majority of primary schools will open as planned on the 4th of January, some primaries in areas with the highest rates of coronavirus won't open on that date, and it's not clear when they will. I'm delighted to be joined by the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson. Mr. Williamson, welcome to Talk Radio.
Good morning, Mark.
Can you tell us why these delays are happening?
Well, over 85% of primary schools will be returning on Monday, absolutely as normal. But we have had to take some quite extraordinary actions in order to be able to do everything we possibly can do to tackle coronavirus. This is why we are having to give schools a little bit of extra time in order for all secondary schools and all colleges to roll out a mass testing regime so that all pupils returning to secondary school will be in the position of having 2 lateral flow tests as they're coming back into school, making sure they go through a full testing regime. And this is about taking the battle to coronavirus. Making sure people can continue in their education, but equally doing everything we can do to root out this disease. Not just keeping schools safer, not just keeping pupils and staff safer, but also keeping communities safer.
Indeed, although it's a shame, isn't it, that children who face no health risk from COVID-19 should be the foot soldiers in this battle, given the fact that they've lost so much classroom time in the course of this year?
Well, as you can imagine, Mark, the last thing I ever want to do is to see any child miss out on a single day's worth of education. And, it's always a decision that you take with an incredibly heavy heart. But what we're doing in terms of a testing regime in secondary schools, we actually, by rolling this out, we feel that we're able to keep more children in school for longer. So I don't know many of about yourself, but many of your listeners, I know that both my 2 daughters have been in the situation of having to self-isolate for 2-week periods, even though they didn't have symptoms of coronavirus, even though they didn't, obviously hadn't had any tests to say they had coronavirus, but they'd been in a bubble of other children, a bubble with another child who's had coronavirus, which meant they missed 2 weeks worth of schooling time. So actually, by having this really robust testing regime, children will be able to stay in school longer. It means that they'll only be out of school if they've got coronavirus, if they've tested positive for coronavirus. It means that they're able to get much more education than they would have done otherwise.
Indeed. Well, it's good to hear that they will get the lateral flow test when they return to school at the secondary level, because those PCR tests are about as convincing as a Gary Barlow tax return. However, once they're tested on entry, will they be tested on a weekly basis?
So what we're doing is we're going to be making sure that there's regular testing. It's going to be the first 2 weeks. They're going to be having those 2 lateral flow tests, and that will be followed up with serial testing for youngsters on a weekly basis.
Okay, well, that's fantastic to hear. In the previous lockdown earlier in the year, there was pushback from the teaching unions. Was that a major factor in why the schools were not able to reopen more quickly towards the end of summer term?
Not at all. We saw actually by the end of the sort of summer term, we saw over 1.6 million children back into schools. You saw exam year cohorts back into schools. You saw reception, year 1, year 6, all back into schools. But the teaching profession have been absolutely heroic over the last year. We've asked so much of so many people. I mean, I think everyone will look back at 2020 and recognise what an incredibly hard year it has been for absolutely everyone across the country. But our teachers, our support staff have done so much in order to make sure children have continued to be able to benefit from a great education.
Well, I think some of them have, haven't they, Secretary of State? Because we've heard amazing stories about how children have managed to continue their education at home. There's been support, I know, in terms of getting technology in the hands of children so that they've got a laptop or an iPad with which to do their studying. But the picture that emerges from calls to this radio program and this radio station are that it's been a mixed bag in terms of the delivery of education for young people at home.
Oh, hello, Mark. I do apologise. Sorry, you broke up actually in terms of that question.
It's no problem at all. I mean, you praise the teachers. I think some teachers,
laptops and devices.
Well, yeah. My audience, a lot of calls to this radio station have suggested that it's been a mixed bag in terms of how well children have been able to learn at home.
Mark, I do apologise. Sorry, during the question you broke up. I got quite a bit of interference, but I think you were asking about how well children have been able to learn at home and the delivery of laptop devices. You're absolutely right. The best type of education is face-to-face education. No matter the efforts that we put into remote education, nothing can ever beat having a teacher at the front of a classroom, inspiring and driving children forward in order to be able to learn. It is the best form of learning, and that's why we're going to these extraordinary efforts in terms of this mass testing program that we're rolling out in secondary schools to make sure that children are able to stay in schools and that they're able to continue to learn in those schools. But we do have to recognise, there's a number, sort of 15% of schools aren't going to be opening as planned on Monday, and that's why we've taken the efforts in terms of rolling out laptops. We've distributed over 500,000 laptops over the last few months. Another 150,000 laptops are going out in the next week, and we're going to be distributing a total of 1 million laptops, supporting children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. We do, though, recognise it's not just about the laptops. It's actually about the teachers following up with children, making sure, checking in, supporting those children in terms of their work. That's what's so absolutely critical. And you've probably noticed, and you've probably already reported, so apologise for this, but we've also made it much clearer as the absolute minimum expectations of what schools have got to deliver for children.
I'm really glad to hear that, because that's when you lost the line. That was my point, is that I've had so many calls from disgruntled parents that they feel that the government are doing their best, but a lot of the schools have sort of dropped the ball in terms of making sure there's a full programme of study for their children. And both my sons are in the state sector, and they've had a brilliant experience. So credit where it's due. In terms of the results for this year, GCSEs and A levels are happening. I'm concerned that your department is going to gerrymander the results this year in order to accommodate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, so that in years to come it will look like this generation are mini Albert Einsteins. That's a big problem for children that haven't had those particular discretionary marking ups in previous years. And also it's bad news for children that will take their GCSEs next year.
Well, we are having a much more generous grading policy this year, mirroring the grading policy of what emerged last year.
But that's deeply unfair, isn't it?
I think it would be grossly unfair to this year's students who are going through their studies, who've actually suffered much more disruption than last year's students. And so this is why we put in a whole set of policies, whether this is about advance notice of the topics that they're going to be examined on.
What's the point in that? I mean, what is the point in telling the kids in advance what the question's going to be, Mr. Williamson?
Well, we're not going to be telling them what the questions are, but we are going to be giving them advance notice on the topics that they're going to be examined on. Because we do recognise in parts of the country, children have missed out on significant parts of their learning. They've had not had the opportunities that in a normal year children would have had. So that's why it's important that we take the measures that we have done. And what's so important is children having the opportunity to sit an exam, having the opportunity to demonstrate what they've learned, prove how good they are. And, we wouldn't be in any normal year be looking at taking these actions, but I think every one of us would agree that 2020 and the early part of 2021 are certainly not going to be classed as normal years.
Absolutely. Now, two quick ones for you. I know you have to run, Secretary of State. First of all, a further 20 million people in England will join the tougher tier of COVID restrictions as of Thursday, and that's, of course, Tier 4. The rollout of Tier 4 it basically tells us one thing and one thing alone, which is that this government has lost control of the virus.
What we're doing is we've seen a new strain of COVID develop, and the government's taking swift and clear action in order to deal with it. That's the right thing to do. That's what the British public expect. That's what the government's doing.
And finally, I quite like your little outbursts, Secretary of State. When you were Defence Secretary, you told Russia to go away and shut up, and rightly so, because they are a considerable foe. They're no friend of this country, and just recently you said that Britain was better than other countries in many ways. So you shoot from the hip, you say it like it is, which we appreciate here at Talk Radio. Would you have any words for the Chinese Communist Party, who are responsible for this pandemic in a sense that at the beginning of the spread of the virus, all they did was lie and obfuscate?
I think that across the world, every nation has suffered greatly as a result of this pandemic. And I think that Britain has been leading the world in terms of this fight, in terms of our research and development. Incredibly proud that the University of Oxford, Imperial College have been leading the scientific sort of breakthroughs in terms of tackling that. And we should take pride that the role that we play on the world stage in terms of leading that battle, but also leading it with other nations, because we're all suffering as a result of it. And by working together, we will defeat it.
Deeply grateful for your time, Secretary of State. Gavin Williamson is the Education Secretary.